Hey, business owners, the NFL season is a big revenue driver. Now there's a smarter way to get ready. EverPass is the only authorized commercial platform for NFL Sunday Ticket, delivering every live out-of-market regular season Sunday afternoon game. Lock in the best offer now with up to 40% off, saving up to $2,500. For the first time, you can pay over 9 months. Get up to 6 free devices and a free bar kit. Sign up by April 27th. Visit everpass.com. Limited time offer. Terms apply.
This episode is part of a long series, exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. This episode can stand on its own, but it will refer to the previous ones. So check out the whole season starting with episode 1, Prologue, What is Biblical? This is Ronald Reagan's Double Cross.
Welcome to Hollywood, California in the 1950s, Tinseltown. If you're gonna make it here, you'll need representation. And there's nobody better than MCA.
MCA represented actors and musicians. They were agents. The agents for people like Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, Errol Flynn, Barbara Stanwyck. If a movie studio wanted to hire an actor,
I want that Groucho Marx for my moving picture.
They didn't speak to the actor. They spoke to the agent who worked out a deal. It's an agent's job to advocate for their client.
You want Groucho? It's gonna cost you.
There was a rule in the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, the union for actors. If you're an agent representing an actor,
Groucho gets 10% of gross on the back end.
You can't also be the producer. There's a good reason for that. Because if the agent is also the producer,
we might be tempted to give the producers, us, a better deal and leave the actors with less money.
Essentially, the movie producer would be negotiating with themselves.
Hello, I'd like to speak to the agent. This is he. Listen, I need that Groucho Marx for my next picture. You know, since you're such a nice guy, you can have Groucho at half his normal rate. Thank you, agent. Thank you, producer.
Which means they may not have the actor's best interest at heart. So that kind of thing was against the rules with SAG. Producers and agents could not be the same people. End of story. Then came the rise of television. Nobody really knew what it was going to become. MCA wanted to get in on the ground floor and start producing their own television shows.
But the Screen Actors Guild had that rule. They couldn't do the work of an agent and that of a producer.
So they applied, asking for an exception to the rule. And they had a little inside track. MCA represented the actor at the top of the Screen Actors Guild, a man on the inside. So when the deal was announced in July of 1952, some eyebrows were raised.
Was the president of the Screen Actors Guild getting kickbacks for making the deal happen?
The union president was not only a client, but also an actor who hadn't had a good role in a while, or made that much money. And suddenly, he's on shows produced by MCA, getting the rate he got back when he was a star, $75,000. And soon, he was the host of the show General Electric Theater, which was produced by MCA. Both the agent and the producer. Did the president of SAG get a sweetheart contract by shafting his union members? In 1961, Attorney General Robert Kennedy's office formed a commission to investigate the MCA deal. Their conclusion stated that the president of SAG
had been given a promise of the role of host of GE Theater as consideration for keeping the actors in line.
In other words, guilty as charged. General Electric didn't like the heat they were receiving. Plus, their spokesman's politics were drawing some bad attention. And that was the end of his time as host of General Electric Theater. The sweetheart deal was over. By now, you've probably guessed. The head of the union was Ronald Reagan, future governor of California and president of the United States. And for years, he'd blame Robert Kennedy and liberals like him for ending his golden moment. Which, yes, he got by selling out the members of his union. Contrast that to something that happened in July of 1981, just a few months into his first term as president of the United States. air traffic controllers announced a strike scheduled for that August. This was a big deal for the country and could mean a huge blow to the economy. Reagan wanted to appear strong, determined. Air traffic controllers were federal employees, and their contract explicitly stated that they were not allowed to strike. At the press conference, Reagan said,
I must tell those who failed to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their job and will be terminated.
And they were. The strikers were fired, the union decertified, and new training programs were put in place to ready new controllers. This gave the president some street cred. He came across as tough, someone who couldn't be pushed around by labor. But stop and think about that for a second. The contrast between the two stories says a lot about Ronald Reagan. He often said he wasn't anti-union. He'd been the head of a union for years. He toured factories with GE telling workers he knew what they were up against. But did he? He sold out his union members for a sweetheart deal and a television gig. Then, while on the road for that job, he gave speeches to workers at General Electric plants blaming big government for their woes, while he was getting paid to be the mouthpiece for their employer. He shut down the airline strike, ruining the careers of thousands of workers. Reagan had a reputation as a man of the people, someone they could relate to, but also someone they felt could lead them. We spent a lot of time this season talking about economics because the country was becoming more conservative. Decades of marketing low taxes and small government were paying off as the country struggled with stagflation, tax revolts, lines at the gas pump, and civil unrest. People were thinking, maybe this actor has a point. Maybe our problem wasn't corporations, but big government. Perhaps the liberal consensus, the New Deal, and the Great Society failed us. One of his biggest legacies was cementing the idea that the government couldn't help us solve problems. It was the problem. And then he became the head of that government, so didn't he then become the problem? Ronald Reagan's business-first stance was about to jump from Hollywood to the national stage. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. Quick biography. Reagan grew up poor. His father had a hard time holding a job, they moved a lot. His mother was a Christian, and he gave money to his church, worked as a lifeguard, dated Christian girls, and as he got older, only sat in the pews occasionally. Worked in radio, then jumped to movies where he mostly worked for Warner Brothers. He served in World War II. Pew, 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 pew. Not shooting a gun, but making propaganda films for the military. Married an actress named Jane Wyman. I do. Got a divorce. I don't. And slept with so many women that he'd wake up and be surprised who was next to him. Excuse me, ma'am. Who are you? A lot of them were young. Much younger than him. He was a New Deal Democrat and a fan of FDR. Used to corner people on the studio lot and talk their ears off about politics. Married his second wife, Nancy, who was herself divorced, and then, well, the phone just stopped ringing. His star began to fade. As movies changed, got deeper, and he aged out of his beefcake roles. Then came the deal with MCA to host General Electric Theater on television. This was a trust fall for Ron, because television was new, but it gave him close ties to people at GE. And this is where our story really takes off. Because his job wasn't just smiling on TV. He went to factories, met laborers, and delivered lectures to promote the company and, wherever possible, shift blame. This is around the time that the other General Motors, distributed a cartoon version of Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, talking trash about planned economies. As Bob Spitz wrote about GE,
it sought to ensure corporate well-being by turning people against government encroachment and regulatory interference, while neutralizing the union's effectiveness.
In return for backstabbing his union and trash-talking another, GE filled his house with appliances and paid him handsomely.
Here's your check, Ronnie, and your plane tickets for next week.
But Reagan did not like to fly. He'd had a close call in an airplane, and so GE sent him everywhere by train, giving him plenty of downtime to read. He enjoyed Reader's Digest, Human Events, and William F. Buckley's National Review. Historian Bob Spitz credits each of these for contributing to this New Deal Democrat becoming a conservative. Scratch that. The face of conservatism. I know, that sounds weird. Reader's Digest. But it offered him short, down-home, easy answers to every question. A hallmark of Reagan as he transitioned into politics. He shot from the hip, but wasn't really a deep thinker. Something that made voters like him, but meant he didn't always consider the cost of his actions. As Bob Spitz wrote in his biography,
Reader's Digest slanted its articles to a largely old-fashioned, conservative, alarmist audience.
And that could be an issue when you consider what journalist Lou Cannon wrote.
Reagan tended to believe anything he read without considering the source.
These publications had a profound impact on his thinking. He even clipped out articles and saved them in his files for future reference. Shaping a future president. Speaking of shaping his way of doing things, let's talk about government involvement in the movie industry.
Buster, roll the film.
This is Washington, D.C. circa 1948, where the studio system is under fire. The United States versus Paramount Pictures declares that the movie companies have a monopoly. They can't own the production houses and the movie theaters.
By the way, this was overturned by the Trump administration in 2020. The studios were getting their hands tied. First, in 1943, Olivia de Havilland sued to break her contract, chipping away at the studio system Ronnie enjoyed. In 1947, he assisted the House Un-American Activities Committee in their search for communists in Hollywood. Then, the 1948 Paramount decision.
All of this at a time when Ronnie Reagan was raking it in, meaning he was getting taxed at a higher rate.
Turning Reagan, this former New Deal Democrat, against progressive taxation, because now it was hitting his pocketbook.
There can be no moral justification of the progressive tax.
Progressive taxation is when wealthy people are taxed at a higher percent of their income than poor people. Though if you've been listening to this season, you know that that is not really the full story. Right? There are lots of loopholes that only rich people can access. Reagan defended big corporations, his buddies, the guys who got him this sweet gig. And for that, he was paid quite well and picked up on their pro-business, anti-workers' rights stance.
The slow, invisible tide of socialism was engulfing America, held back only by a few brave businessmen.
Ronnie benefited from the studio system, though Warner's had trapped him in a lot of bad roles and was constantly playing games with him, especially once he became president of SAG and negotiated against them. But it's not like Reagan was ever 100% anti-union. In his speeches before GE employees, he often transitioned from Hollywood stories to saying that Hollywood unions were infiltrated by communists. The union he'd just represented. Was he calling himself a communist? Then he transitioned to saying that progressive taxation started with the communist revolution. Oh, Ronnie. That's how Ronald Reagan went from being a New Deal Democrat to a business-first conservative. He worked for a big company, one of the biggest, read conservative magazines, and turned against progressive taxation once it put a crimp on him. And of course, having his career ended by Robert Kennedy's investigation. Enough to make a guy throw on some sweatpants and watch all 3 channels of television.
But that wasn't the end for Ronald Reagan.
No, it wasn't. Reagan was still making paid appearances, delivering variations on his pat talk, what was nicknamed the speech. Then came a big break from a surprising place. He was approached by the Barry Goldwater campaign to deliver the speech at a fundraiser. And it brought down the house. The speech included a lot of the stuff he'd been upset about for years. Taxes, communism, big government, but also some stretches of imagination. Some of the fundraisers, these big donors, wanted to run the speech as an ad for Barry Goldwater, with the odd side effect that the ad made people think that maybe Reagan was a better candidate than the guy he was endorsing, causing donations to pour in. Here are some highlights.
We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world.
Note the focus on the national debt, something that used to be a major issue for conservatives but hasn't been for a while. Reagan, of course, would go on as president to balloon said national debt with his tax cuts and defense buildup. Then there were the fears of a planned economy.
This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government, or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
It also raised concerns about farm programs, took some fair shots at a scandal in the Johnson administration, criticized welfare, and jabbed at Social Security, something he stated elsewhere should be voluntary. All this was music to the ears of people who wanted to cut taxes and social programs. Like a group of wealthy people in Southern California who approached Reagan with an idea. Would he consider running for governor? The Southern California thing sounds like just location data. But remember from the John Birch Society episode that SoCal was a hotbed of far-right politics and conspiracy theories in the late 1960s and early 70s. Also, the home of R.J. Rushdoony's backers. One of the reasons why Richard Nixon lost his bid for governor of California was because he didn't play nicely with the extremists down there. They had clout. When asked if he was a Bircher, Reagan responded,
I don't think so.
Though he told a friend that he agreed with their underlying premise, that communism was the source of all evil, and it wasn't fair to label all Birchers as crazies. His supporters, like Goldwater's, opposed a platform initiative to condemn the JBS. Ron's wife, Nancy, was not on board with him running. So he did 6 months of speaking tours to gauge interest before finally throwing his hat into the ring in December of 1965. During his run, he said that American troops in Vietnam
are being denied the right to try for victory in that war.
He wanted to step up actions there. He also thought that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and a California law preventing discrimination in housing sales and rentals were unconstitutional. Hey, pause there for a second.
Take 5, everybody. Take 5.
It won't take 5 minutes.
3 minutes, everyone.
Why did I hire that guy for the whole day? Okay, so racism takes different shapes. These laws prevented discrimination in things like employment, voting, and housing. Let's simplify this to 2 sides.
I'm in business, a man in power.
And I'm an employee.
Remember back to my episodes about Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley. I went on and on about how conservatism had had factions in it going back to the late 1800s. Those who defaulted towards doing everything for businesses, and those who were moderates. Goldwater represented a big boost for the business-first faction. Reagan carried that forward. So if you're a business person who, wanted to discriminate,
I should be able to do so without big government telling me what to do.
Even if it means not hiring someone because of their race, gender, religion, etc. Or not allowing them to live in your apartment building or buy your house.
When it came down to protecting the little guy, or businessmen like me, Reagan defaulted to protecting business interests.
Just like that faction of conservatism had for years.
From my perspective, it's business people who make the world go round. So we should protect them.
But from my perspective, as an employee, they're making decisions that impact my life based on something like race or gender. That's why I see opposition to the Civil Rights Act or similar legislation as racist or sexist.
There's an uneasy mixture of de jure racism and de facto racism. It's building a system that bends towards racism, de facto racism, and protecting people who want the right to discriminate, de jure racism. Some business people saw equal rights laws as crimping industry, but people affected saw Reagan's opposition for what it was, wanting a get-out-of-jail-free card for racists. You can hear that in one of Reagan's statements about that California Housing Act.
I have never believed that majority rule has the right to impose on an individual as to what he does with his property.
His concern was about the property owner's right to discriminate, not the right of the renter to not be discriminated against. Again, it was not a new opinion. It was that business first faction getting oxygen. See it? They wanted to take us back to the 1920s, before all the regulations, before the New Deal, when a person could choose not to hire someone for whatever reason they wanted, favoring the interests of business over the interests of the people, as he had with the MCA deal, as he did when he badmouthed unions to GE's union employees, as he would when he fired air traffic controllers for striking, always favoring business interests. This continued throughout his presidency. Is it any wonder that in 1984, a Gallup poll showed that 72% of black voters thought Reagan was racially prejudiced? 72%. End of digression.
We're back, everybody. We're back.
And we're taking a break.
What's that you say?
It's time for commercials. After these messages, we'll see how Reagan performed as a governor and then follow him to the White House. While you wait for me to return, why not subscribe so you get every new episode as it's released? Hitting that subscribe button means that my download numbers will be more consistent. And while you're in your podcasting app, why not leave 5 stars and a positive comment? It really helps. Okay, here come the ads.
This message comes from the Enneagram and Marriage podcast. Have you wanted to improve your relationship, but you're running out of ideas, time, or even interest? I'm Krista Harden, the host of the Enneagram and Marriage podcast, and I've dedicated the last 2 decades of my life and career on couples research, integrating healthy faith practices with the best of marriage research and nuanced personality typing. Couples from all over the world are finding more value-centered joy and bringing healthy desire, love, and fun back into their bond together again or for the very first time as they work strategically and intentionally on repatterning their love in healthy ways. Join us on Mondays or Wednesdays to listen and learn more about how your life and relationship can truly thrive together.
Welcome back to Truce. Today we're talking about Ronald Reagan's run to the White House. When Reagan became governor of California, the state was a mess. The previous administration left a pile of debt and did some creative accounting. The advice they got?
Cut the budget by 10%, call in business leaders, and eliminate 3,700 jobs in mental health. Then go after the state's university system.
Reagan was a legendary delegator. He could be the public face of the state during the day and get home at a reasonable time most nights to watch TV with Nancy. Meanwhile, his staff did a lot of the work, sometimes without Reagan knowing the details. All legislative information had to first go through his chief of staff. He rarely hobnobbed with the legislature or staff members. What had been an important after-hours way of getting work done or building bridges.
Hey, Gipper, come have a beer with us.
No, thank you very much. Match game's coming on. Ronnie also insisted that all of his memos be condensed to what was known as mini-memos. 4 sections on 1 sheet of paper featuring the issue, relevant facts, pros and cons, and recommendations. Issues, he thought,
should be played by ear.
He wanted to go with his guts rather than dig into a host of facts. One gut decision stuck with him for a long time. It was 1967. Roe v. Wade had not yet been decided. The Therapeutic Abortion Act hit the California legislature, which would allow for abortions in cases of rape and incest, and if the child would be born with grave physical or mental defects. It had wide support, though many Catholics were upset about it. Since the religious right had not yet taken shape, not many other religious people fought it.
Yeah, we're not gonna fight on this one, we'll pass.
Reagan hadn't thought deeply about this issue before, and his cabinet was split. Ultimately, he had the rape and deformity clauses removed and signed it into law. When leaving the White House decades later, he told a reporter it was his chief regret.
In all the years he was governor of California and president of the United States.
And then came the unthinkable. Ronald Reagan, a man who campaigned against high taxes, raised taxes in California. Again, going back to conservatism in days of old, this was fine in the 1940s with guys like Senator Robert Taft. Not so much with this new kind of conservative. Reagan's staff was thinking about a presidential run from the time he arrived in the governor's office. But he was not ready to announce. It wasn't until 1976, after he was no longer governor, that Reagan really gave it all he had. But he was defeated in the primaries by incumbent Gerald Ford. We don't have a lot of time to get into that run, but I want to spend a moment on a memo from the Ford campaign. They were genuinely struck by the power of Reagan.
The unexpected Reagan success in certain caucus states, New Mexico, Kansas, Colorado, seems puzzling. Turnout is very high. The people coming to vote or to the caucuses are unknown and have not been involved in the Republican political system before. They vote overwhelmingly for Reagan.
New people were showing up, folks from the far right. The memo went on to identify the people rallying him. It singled out Richard Viguerie, one of the founders of the New Right, and his mailing campaigns. Groups funded by Joseph Coors, the beer magnate who helped establish the Heritage Foundation. It also listed the NRA. Reagan wasn't just running in 1976. He was the poster boy for a growing movement to change the face of conservatism, something that genuinely concerned the Ford campaign, the most establishment of establishment people. Literally, the sitting president of the United States. Years later, after he won the 1980 RNC nomination, Reagan's first meet and greet as an official candidate was supposed to be at the National Urban League, a venerable civil rights organization. But a scheduling problem pushed them back. Now his first appearance as the GOP's nominee would be at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi, where Black people were only there as employees. I spoke with historian Angie Maxwell about this when we discussed her book, The Long Southern Strategy.
There was so much disaffection with the Democratic Party in the South already when Nixon was running, but Reagan's got to kind of win them back from a Jimmy Carter. So Reagan does something really interesting. His team polls 40,000 American women, and they divide them up into 64 categories, give them names, Bettys, Helens. They do a deep dive into, because there were rumors that Reagan had like a woman problem, or that was the rumor, right? They had not moved as much as Southern white men towards the Republican Party.
They did a deep dive because Southern women had a problem with Reagan. Southern men were on the Reagan train, but not their wives.
And what they realize is there's not just a racial issue. White Southern electorate, particularly women who have become politicized to stop the ERA.
To win Southern women, he had to be anti-Equal Rights Amendment, even though it was the Republican Party who was the first to support it in 1940. They dropped it in 1980.
Reagan really adopts a persona that is pro-traditional gender roles, kind of a Marlboro man, hyper kind of masculine, portrays his, marriage and relationship as very traditional gender roles, even though Nancy Reagan had been a working actress.
Nancy Reagan became very involved in his time in the White House, calling his chief of staff multiple times a day and driving him nuts, and pressing for changes in his administration. But traditional gender roles would appeal to the South, and they needed the South, which meant finding the new team members who could help them there.
Who was Reagan's Southern Field campaign director? A young Paul Manafort.
Donald Trump's 2016 campaign chairman, who was later pardoned for a series of nefarious deeds from illegal foreign lobbying to tax fraud. These kind of guys tend to stick around.
Some of the same kind of small group of folks who go, this is what works in this region, and we have to play to this.
They gave Reagan advice on how to win the South.
So announcing and talking about states' rights when you're the governor of liberal California and a former actor down in Mississippi is an effort to say, I know that Jimmy Carter guy's one of y'all, but I'm one of y'all too.
Though he was supposed to begin his campaign reaching out to Black people, he ended up in Mississippi talking states' rights to appeal to racists by literally saying,
I believe in states' rights.
That was a big deal at a fair that had long been a stopping point for politicians wanting to complain about the evil federal government and civil rights organizations. In an area known for its Klan activity, including the murder of 3 voter registration workers discovered in an earthen dam just a few years earlier, not far from where Reagan gave his address. Max Boot, in his excellent biography, relays a list of ways that the campaign reached out to white voters in other contexts. One was his support for legislation, or even a constitutional amendment, outlawing integrating schools through busing. Another was his talk about welfare queens, or women who played the government system by using false identities and marrying multiple men, something that liberal and black people saw as a racially charged claim.
May I interrupt?
I don't know, I guess so.
She was based on a real woman.
That is correct. But the real woman who would become the legendary welfare queen was identified as white at birth. She pretended to be other races to bilk not just the government, but private people as well. Can you just invoice me and head home for the day?
I'm cool. I can wait.
I wish I never promised him a ride. Reagan also spoke against government moves to revoke tax-exempt status from private segregated schools, some of which, to our shame, were run as religious academies. He also took shots at the Voting Rights Act, saying it would lead to
a new wave of carpetbaggers to look over the shoulder of your local officials, just as Reconstruction did in 1865.
Reconstruction being the era after the Civil War, when the North occupied the South and pushed it to treat black people more humanely. Not to mention Reagan's opposition to sit-ins at lunch counters because it disrupted law and order. Reagan was endorsed by the Grand Wizard of the KKK, who said the platform read,
as if it were written by a Klansman.
As I said previously, it's not like Carter was squeaky clean on race either. Both parties missed the boat at various times. But this was flagrant. Reagan campaigned by following Nixon's lead and appealing to racists. In the next episode, we'll explore the ways that Reagan and his team courted the religious right, and were courted by the religious right. But I want to pause for a moment right where we are. I went into all this material about race for a reason, because it ties into the top of the show where Reagan supported MCA over actors, then fought air traffic controllers as president. Ronald Reagan saw the world as Ayn Rand did, at least in one way. That the powerful, people like corporations or the white majority, were under attack by those with a lower social status. That to tax or hinder business interests was to reduce liberty, even if that meant that those with higher status could turn around and hinder the liberty of those with lower status. By the way, Reagan claimed to be a fan of Rand, though I have no idea how much of her books he read. She, by the way, disapproved of his connection to the religious right. It seemed disingenuous for him, as the head of the Screen Actors Guild, to commit his union to a bad deal so he could get a plush TV gig. A simple quid pro quo. But it actually lines up with the kinds of decisions he made for the rest of his life. When it came down to choosing between helping a big company or an individual, he chose the company. The powerful. It's that business-first kind of republicanism that was pushed in the late 1800s and 1920s. It didn't take hold until big money built a consensus in the 1950s around concerns over communism. It was assembled by pro-business groups like the National Association of Manufacturers, GE, and GM. Despite all the connections to business, a lot of people in the US saw Reagan as a beacon of hope. He promised them tax cuts in a time when, to be fair, taxes were high. He promised ends to budget overruns, even though he ballooned the national debt. In a time of strife and anger, in a calm and fatherly way, he offered hope. Where Carter lectured the public, Reagan told them they could be great. Even if he didn't have their personal interest in mind, he could make them feel something. And in 1980, that was enough to get him to the White House. I'll continue the story in the next episode. I used a bunch of sources for this, including Rick Perlstein's books The Invisible Bridge and Reaganland, Reagan, An American Journey by Bob Spitz, and Reagan, His Life and Legend by Max Boot. Not to mention Reagan, A Life and Letters, published by Free Press. A complete list of sources is available in your show notes and on the website at trucepodcast.com. I'm going to spend several episodes with Reagan because he's an interesting nexus of a lot of things we've discussed this season. From the ERA to taxes to the rise of the religious right. It's important that we understand him because he became the conservative, almost an idol. We need to spend some time here, and there's going to be some really interesting stuff. If you like the Truce Podcast, please subscribe in your podcasting app. It means that you'll get every new episode as it's released. And tell your friends. It goes a long way. I don't have a marketing team, and I need your help to spread the word. And I'm doing this show full-time on a tight budget. If you'd like to help me make this show and, keep the lights on, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. There you can learn how to help on Venmo, PayPal, check, credit card, all sorts of different ways. It's super easy. That's trucepodcast.com/donate. Thanks to all of my friends who gave me their voices for this episode, including Bob Stevenson, Jackie Hart, Chris Sloan, Dave Monroe, Josh Griffith, and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership Podcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Tap the banner to learn more and get a quote at USAA.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.